Sometimes I swear, you probably get this feeling too. You look at the scripture text, and you look at the songs we pick, and then I just need to stand up and go, amen. Thank the Lord for the friends that have been placed in our path. Drink to the future, drink to the past. Great words, great things to think about. Thank you, Sharm, for that kairos too. I love the image of standing in the stream. We stand in the stream, and what's interesting about this text, of course, Ecclesiastes, is the way in which Ecclesiastes, the author of Ecclesiastes, Koheleth, was what we often say as the preacher. Actually, the Hebrew word means Ecclesiastes. Basically, it's the Hebrew word for the same title that it is. So we don't really know who the author is, although it's stated that it's Solomon. It could be a pseudonym. But the idea is that everything is in this dichotomous relationship, in this repetitive sort of dichotomous relationship, right? There's life, there's death, there's peace, there's a time for war, there's a time for casting stones, a time to gather up stones. It's this idea that life is kind of this black and white, all this sort of dichotomous reality. And sometimes I think perhaps it can feel that way in retrospect. You can look back and you can kind of begin to wonder. But I think what Ecclesiastes is doing more than anything is what we now know by a lot, now what we know scientifically. Ecclesiastes is literally acting out of his, I'm assuming it was a male author, acting out of his neurological patterns, right? He's acting out of his neurological networks, which oftentimes is the first place we go. We go to these places of familiarity. We go to these places that seek protection when we're afraid, that seek some kind of familiarity when we're surrounded by what's unfamiliar. And we actually lose fact, or we lose sight of what we've done in the past or what was different in the past. As we've talked about in the first week, it's much easier for our neurons, our neural pathways to pick up negative things, right? Negative stuff glues to our neurons and our neural networks. It glues to it, and positive experiences seem to just wash off like water on a duck's back. And it's the same thing that we've heard maybe in child rearing, that it's so much harder if we raised our children with sort of this stress and this pressure or this negativity, or perhaps even in some of the most extreme with abusiveness. When that happens, those kinds of moments cling more than all the positive. It takes so much more positive or so much more affirmation to sort of counteract those things. And so the challenge for us is always to try to figure out then how to get perspective on these patterns, how to find a way to step back and see them in the midst of experiencing them. So we have this whole series called Catching Fire, which is basically, I've subtitled it, living a life of exuberance, but it's, exuberance we think of as joy, and I don't want to think so much of as giddiness and joy and just I'm really happy, although I love the image of the guy, I'm thinking it's the little girl, of singing, I guess she's singing, and the camel complaining, or maybe singing with her, I'm not sure. But I love this image. This ability to just sort of sing out in the midst of the desert. So we're thinking of exuberance. What does it mean to live in the midst of the life that we have? And how do we find pathways of joy in the midst of pathways of sort of pessimism or negativity or just the world we live in? So our first Sunday was on passion. But I wanted to introduce the idea of passion in contrast to passivity. I talked a little bit about how we think of passion as that thing we give our life to. Passivity is actually what we end up turning our life inward because we're not giving it to something. And it often finds its consequence in passive-aggressive behavior, right? Or it finds its consequence in a sense of unlived life. So then I talked about path. And that's what we're doing, is we're looking at a path to find our way, to find some perspective, to find some exuberance in the midst of the daily stuff. So passion, passivity, path, and then I talked about practice, a little homework, if you remember. Some of you actually came up to me afterwards and said you were actually trying this. That I told you 15, 20 seconds to look at something and to just spend a moment with it, because the science has actually found that if you simply sit with something, not if you say the rose is really pretty today, and look at those pretty roses there, but you actually sit with the rose, or you actually reflect upon the rose for a little bit. You begin to sort of analyze it just enough, 15, 20 seconds, and suddenly something changes. Matthew and I, my younger son and I, were sitting outside of Barnes & Noble, and we were talking about some of the patterns we find ourselves in, some of these repetitive things that we can't seem to get out of. And I noticed he was just getting kind of bogged down. These young adults are getting bogged down in sort of what's going on and how he's struggling to try to break free from some of these patterns. And I noticed this big, beautiful sort of granite rock that was sitting in the grass under a tree in the parking lot. And I said, well, check that rock out. And it was kind of dark. It was about 9 o'clock. And I said, check that rock out. And he's like, what? I said, just look at the rock. And so we were looking at the rock, and I said, what do you see? And he says, I see a rock. I said, no, look again. He says, I don't know, what do you see? I see a frog. Don't you see the bullfrog? And he's looking at it for a second. He goes, oh my God, it is a bullfrog. And he starts to notice it too. And then he says, look, it's got its arms crouched, right? Because now we see the rock and we see the little shapes in it. And sure enough, it looks like it's got two big eyes, and it's just giant boulders kind of thing. Looks like a bullfrog. And I said, how did that feel for a second? And he looked over and he said, I don't know, it felt kind of nice for just a moment. That's all the practice requires, to do that daily. Just take 20 seconds to be present with something, to see something differently, and you begin to change some of those patterns. And then last week, Sharm spoke about finding the strength that we have, that we already have. We have more strength than we think we have, leaning into those in our past who have been there for us, into moments of our past, reflecting on times in our past when we were able to overcome or deal with a situation. Those strengths are still with us. And the people that we turn to, all of these inner resources that we have, inner and outer, resources that we have to lean on that are there present with us, that we forget when we're in the midst of sort of seeing the tree but not the forest. And so today I want to talk with you a little bit about perspective. So I've got this whole idea of the whole shebang, right? Kit and caboodle, the whole big picture. What is the big picture? And it's funny because when we say that, when we often will say the term the whole shebang, we're just using it as a way to sort of passively express that it's everything. It's just everything. It's like the whole thing. And we really aren't thinking about the whole thing, right? Because what we're really thinking about is how we're overwhelmed, because now we're just sort of in this moment of being overwhelmed. We're not actually thinking about the whole thing. So the test here, the challenge here, is to start to see how we can step back and see the forest instead of just seeing the tree. My son Tim, Linda is over in Germany right now having a great time with Tim and Emily and our new granddaughter Maeve and then our other granddaughter Molly, and they keep sending pictures back, and at one point I just said, stop it, how is this helpful? But they're beautiful. But right now it's beautiful weather, just like today. It's like this, been this way the whole week. I'm so happy for her because it's really been a beautiful trip for her and for Maeve and for them all to be present. So, but I was reminded of a time when Tim was about 7 years old and he was in the back seat of the car and we were having one of these parent argument things, right? Then Tim was arguing about something and he was mad about something, and Linda looked at him and she said, Tim, you're being so negative about this. And he was like, I am not. He didn't know the difference between negative and positive. And she says, maybe if you took a little more positive outlook on this, it would be better. And he's like, no, I didn't get what I wanted. And so finally, she pulled off the side and gave him a little teaching story. And she said, okay, Tim, just think about this. She said, here's the difference between being a pessimist and an optimist. And she said, there was this parent, the father and mother, and they decided to give their child a present, and one of their kids was always negative, and one of their kids was always positive. Well, they decided to give their negative kid a box with horse manure in it. And then they gave their positive kid, it was for Christmas, they gave their positive kid a box with a new Nintendo game system in it. And so when the kids opened up the game system, the negative kid who got the game system looked at it and said, wait a minute, this is cool and everything, but it's not the most recent one. There's a newer model that's come out, Mom. That's the one I wanted. This one is last year's model. You could have even waited and gotten the new one at a discount. That's the negative kid who got the game system. She said, then the positive kid who got the box of horse manure, he opened it up, and he's looking at this horse manure and a big smile on his face, and he's throwing the horse manure all over the place. And Mom says, what are you doing? And he says, there's a horse in here somewhere. Well, Tim didn't get the joke, but he was looking at her, and she said, well, Tim, what would you rather be? Would you rather be the pessimist or the optimist? And he said, I'd rather be an Episcopalian. So how do you get perspective on things when you're sort of buried? I mean, it's in one sense, it's a matter of trying to see the forest past the trees, but in another sense, it's also got this paradoxical relationship, this understanding where we also need to be very present with the tree to experience the forest, right? So there's this way in which we get so overwhelmed by the tree, and part of the problem is that we're not really connecting with the problem. We're being overwhelmed by the problem. And one of the best ways to sort of get connected to the bigger picture is to get connected to the problem in a more tangible way, to be more present with it. And that's always a challenge, I think. I think we live in this culture right now where it's hard to kind of open up because we have a culture that feels a little overwhelming. We have a culture that seems to be caught up in anxiety, and not in the actual what's causing the anxiety, but simply just the anxiety. So that now catchwords, right? Now catchphrases carry the anxieties with them. So it's no longer what is a Republican or what is a Democrat. It's Republicans are bad or good, or Democrats are bad or good. It's just the word. And the words themselves now carry all sorts of anxieties or stress. You know, you might think it's positive because you get to rally around one idea over another, but that's not rallying. That's really just stressing. That's not really releasing the anxiety from that. You rally with others against one opinion or one action, and you're really just creating more anxiety. It's just in your favor, but it's still anxiety. We no longer see the trees. We no longer even see the tree we're thinking about. We no longer see the issue. It's the same going on for our church as we struggle with what about human sexuality and what it means to be inclusive or non-inclusive. My family recently had this birthday party, and I know I talk about my family from time to time, and I know some of you are like, I don't think I really want to hang around Tom. I'm going to end up on a sermon illustration. And you can pretty much safe to say that if you're family, that's a good chance. If you're not family, not necessarily a chance that I'll talk about you in public, in front of you as well. But with my family, I'm like David Sedaris. I don't know if some of you all listen to David Sedaris, who makes his living off of writing stories about his family, and once was sitting with his sister who was weeping in the car, and she was saying, "You cannot tell anyone about this." And David says, "I instinctively grabbed my pen and pad." So we were sitting around at a birthday party the other day, and my brother, who's not here, Stan, but he's okay with me sharing this. Both my brother and brother-in-law. Stan's my future brother-in-law, and they've recently been engaged, and so they're actually going to have the ceremony this summer, and in Colorado. And clearly, I'm going to be limited in what I can do because in the Methodist Church, it's still an issue that's being dealt with, and it hasn't been decided. So it could be a problem for me, problem for the church, and it could get kind of interesting. But I will be participating in some way. Linda and I both are very much supportive and in love with Stan and with Mike as a couple. And we're sitting at this table now. At the table are a couple of Trump supporters and a couple of libertarians, and then there's also a couple of diehard Democrats, and then there's a couple of evangelical fundamentalists, and then there's a couple of actually there's a queen and king of the Southwest United States region of Society for Creative Anachronism. Right, for the medieval role-playing group, which is a huge group in the Southwest. How many of you all are involved with that? Yeah, I didn't think so. But I didn't think you confess in public. But actually, it's quite a thing to be the king and queen. It's quite a thing. My 38-year-old nephew and his wife are king and queen for the third time in 10 years. They've been elected, crowned, whatever they do to make you king and queen. But there's all sorts of battles and weaponry and all sorts of interesting costuming. And I looked at his son who's 11, and he says, my dad makes my costumes, which was, I just looked over and I said, that's amazing. And then Brandon also rebuilds cars. So right now he's working and completely restoring a 66 Mustang from the frame up, basically starting at, just gutted the whole thing, starting over, has 5 or 6 remodeled, restored old cars, and just an amazing person. And yet a gun-toting, NRA card-carrying NRA member, and we'll get in big arguments sometimes on Facebook, back and forth. He's sitting at the table, right? So my brother turns to me and says, I'm going to announce the date for the wedding. And I'm looking at him and going, I'm going to get my pen and paper out. And Stan's like, this could be a moment of tension, right? This could just be a moment of tension. And I just said, I looked at him and I said, look at this table. We're all sitting down, we're laughing, we're having food together, we're celebrating our birthdays and all of our interesting curiosities. I said, I think it's going to be fine. Right? So anyway, he does it, and the expected outcome is what happened. Some people were very quiet, others were cheering along, and others were like, I want to be there and such. And then my sister leaned over to me, because I'm a minister, and she leaned over and she said, Tommy, are you okay with this? And I love my sister. And my sister's one of the most compassionate, missional people that I know. She just will give. And I looked around the table, and I looked at her, and I said, what do you see at this table? And she said, well, I see my family. And I said, well, that's right. And I said, what else do you see? And she says, well, I see we're getting along. And I said, you know what I see? I see love. I just see love. There's my nephew. He and I disagree on about 80% of stuff. I am so proud of how he's raising his son. I just said, well, I disagree with him about a lot of things, but I am so proud about how he's raising his son. Such a nice kid, such a thoughtful kid. And then I looked around the table and I just talked about what makes me proud. Sure, there's differences, but I wasn't looking at the trees. I wasn't looking at an individual tree. I was looking at the whole forest. And yet to look at the whole forest, what do you have to do? You have to open up yourself a little bit, right? You have to open up yourself a little bit to be present with the tree that's right there in front of you. Because if you're not opened up just a little bit, you miss it. And all you see is what your neural network is telling you, and not what's reality. And I just smiled and I said, it's bigger than our differences. That's where I'm going to settle for a while. It's just being in that place that's bigger than our differences. How do we find perspective in the midst of the trees? How do we find that place that we can be connected with life in the midst of what seems frustrating or pessimistic or anxiety-producing? I was reading this wonderful book by Rebecca Solnit. She's a wonderful essayist and writer. She wrote a book a few years ago called Hope in the Dark. And it was actually written around 2009 or 10, and it was written looking at all of the crises, the financial crises that were happening in 2007 and 8, and looking at how things were happening politically, but especially financially, economically, and the disparity. And she was reflecting back on that, and then there was an edited version, 2016, which kind of included what's happened since then. And she made this comment saying, it's interesting to her, she said, that even though the book was written about 2009 and 8 and 7, specifically about the economic downturn and sort of the anxiety with all of that, and would there be any hope? And she said, not a lot's changed. It seems like we're still struggling with these same kinds of issues 7 years, 6 years later. But she said, then I reflected back on 9/11, and she put this in the news section. And she said, if you go back, because she said she wrote a book in between the two editions. She wrote a book about the stories of the people, a book about the people at 9/11 who were outside of the primary rescuing people, the primary first responders. This was just like the ferry boat drivers, right? This was the people on the street, the taxi drivers who got out of their car and ran into the dust and the debris and tried to find folks. This was just the thousands of other people, literally, hundreds and hundreds of other people who ran into it, not just the firemen and the rescue workers, but all these other people who drove in, rode in, took the boats into this mess to try to find people. And she said stories began to stand out. And there was too many to talk about today, but one that stood out in my mind was this one rabbi, he wasn't a rabbi, he was Jewish, and he was coming through the crowd, through the dust and all the crowd of people running, and he heard someone screaming to his left. But it was all dusty and foggy and couldn't see much. And as he looked to the left, he saw someone wearing a turban and dressed in like a hijab and very much a Middle Eastern, looked Muslim. But he wasn't really thinking about that, except that the man's legs were trapped under some debris. And he was hollering out. And so the Jewish man, he said he rushed over, lifted it up, and the guy reached out his hand, and the Jewish man said, he reached out and he said, take my hand and we'll get out of this together. And he pulled him up from the debris, and they both limped out. And Solnit said, you'll find story and story after story about people who rushed in. And it made me wonder, none of that was predicated on political orientation. None of people helping one another was predicated on sexual orientation or socioeconomic status. None of that was predicated on belief systems or whether or not once you got clear of all of that and you took a long shower and 3 weeks later I found you on the corner and you were going to preach to me that I was going to hell because I didn't think like you thought. None of that was present. What seemed to be present was another human being in pain. And they reached out to one another. And I think you know that's true for all of us, that we're all in that place. What happens to us too often is when we get settled, it seems that's when we get most defensive. But when we get called upon and the opportunity to love, that's when we reach out without second thought. That's the opportunity. I'm going to invite the band to come on back up here as I finish with the last thought. That's the opportunity I think we have. So here's what I want to suggest for you this week as I give you a little bit of homework. Okay? The first thing is to get perspective. One of the ways that I think we can get perspective on those trees that are right in front of us and we can't see the forest because we're clouded up is to be present with the problem for a minute, to ask questions of it. We start there. Don't run from it. Don't deny it. Don't hide from it. If you're anxious about something, don't hide from that. But here's what I suggest you do. I used to do this with storytellers whenever we would write stories and work on our performances. I called it the geography of the story. If you sit and close your eyes for just a moment and imagine that you're actually in that place. In fact, you can actually stand up and just imagine you're in that scene. You're in that setting. I would do this with the storytellers, and I would say, if you would stop for a moment and turn and look around you, you will see there's all sorts of things there that you didn't know were there because you were just thinking about this part of the story. You were just telling this side of the story or this perspective of the story. But if you looked around, you'd see there were other people present. You would see that there are redbirds up in the trees right there in the forest just beyond your front yard where you hadn't been looking. You will see all these things that you didn't see before because you were too focused and yet not seeing anything or not seeing all of it. So I call it geography of the story, but you can do the same thing with the problem that you're experiencing. You can stand for just a moment or sit for a moment and imagine that, but then step back from it a little ways and ask, who else is there? Who else is there who's not a part of the problem? Who else is there that's supportive of you? Who else is there that has a different perspective on that problem than you do? One of my greatest challenges is making my mind up about something when I'm looking out there at the crowd, and I've already decided, you're bored to tears, I can just tell. You're not engaged, you hate this. I am wasting your time, I feel terrible. And I've already gone to that place, right? And then afterwards, someone will tell me later in the week, I was dealing with the worst headache that day. I had this terrible headache, right? I mean, the reality is what my uncle would tell us is that what do I know for sure? He would say, what I know for sure is that I do not know what I do not know. And that's the hardest thing for us to practice. But when we do this geography of story, we're telling ourselves, we're reminding ourselves there's more to this story than I know because I don't know what I don't know. So practice that a little bit. Practice stopping with it for a little ways and looking around it, stepping back from it. Go ahead and be present with it, though, but then just practice seeing the bigger picture. And then the other thing is that instead of, and here's another little positive sort of practice that you can engage your day. Instead of saying that I have to do something, or instead of saying that these are things that I have to engage in, that I have to deal with this problem, that I have to go to this store to go grocery shopping, that I have to, instead of doing all that, just try saying, I get to. Right? Just like my son, and when I wrote about the blog, we're at Six Flags, and we're standing in line. It's the fourth turnstile out of 50, and we've got 46 to go, right? And we're all going, this is so unbelievably difficult to stand here. It's getting so tiring and hot. And my son looks up and goes, I'm at Six Flags. Right? On your worst day, you could be at Six Flags. You're still at Six Flags. So get some perspective. It's not, I have to, I get to. I get to go out and be a part of life. It's Earth Day. This week, I get to go out and plant some seeds of love and hope. I get to do that. Try practicing that and see if that doesn't give some new perspective on where we are in the midst of where things are today.